we're going to focus primarily on the theories of these three things. So what is capitalism? What is neoliberalism? And how are those two things distinct from each other? And then what does Marx have to say about capitalism in particular? We'll talk for a little bit afterwards about deploying Marxism in debate, although we are primarily going to be focused on the theories of these things, just to make sure that we've got a kind of good understanding of what each of these positions say and kind of the distinctions between them, so that we can kind of, properly explain them. And we're going to go in this order. So we'll go capitalism, then neoliberalism, then we'll talk about Marxism. So capitalism. It is an economic system whereby ownership of production belongs to businesses and is primarily oriented around for profits. So there is a private sector owned and regulated by individual businesses and by corporations. And this is how the market itself functions. Okay, and it has a particular focus on the market. That is important for when we're understanding the difference between capitalism and neoliberalism. There will be more on that later. But capitalism is about the economic system. Okay, so it is about the economic system. The totality of capitalism so totality is kind of this term that Marx uses to talk about the kind of complete or whole of human existence. And so here's how the totality of capitalism works at the most basic level according to Marx. First, Marx says that we exist in an economy in which the worker does not have ownership over the fruits of their own labor, which means, in other words, that there's kind of a hierarchy of labor whereby the employer gains the labor from the worker. As the worker or the proletariat, we sell our labor power for a wage, which in our case, as the worker, tends to be money. But that wage relation is always an unfair exchange because your employer sells your labor for more profit than it is actually worth, which is how capital is actually created. Okay, so the process of capital creation is one that is fundamentally unfair. It is one in which we sell our labor power for a wage to our employers, okay? And the employers garner profit based off of that wage relation. So capital is a really interesting term because it is defined as value in motion. In other words, it is a process that is created over time rather than just one individual thing. So you should not think of capital as just money or just profit, but rather it is the process created by the totality that is capitalism. Okay, so it is about the creation of that over time. So the capitalist will create capital by combining the labor power of the worker with the means of production to produce a new commodity, which is then sold for surplus value, i.e. it's sold for profit. Okay, thanks. This process gets repeated ad infinitum as capital continues to be accumulated and the system continues to grow. Okay, so that is how capitalism works, right? It is the creation of capital, which is the process of creating value over time. Okay, so it's the kind of accumulation of resources, money, etc. This process may seem cyclical, but you should really think of it as more of a spiral. Okay, so it's not just the same thing over and over again, but rather it's a spiral, meaning that there is always a continuous incentive to create more surplus and profit. But that process always has to be in flux, or in other words, is always transitioning. Okay, right? So the way that the capitalist wants to talk about this is to assume that it is a circle, right? It just continually happens. It's the same thing. It stays in the same state. But the kind of anti-capitalist position, or really the reality, is that it is a spiral, which means that it's a process that's in flux. It's always transitioning. So there are always going to be road bumps in this process of capital creation. These could be simple in the sense of, for example, we've ran out of materials. And so we need to go, we as in the capitalists, need to go elsewhere in order to find new materials. Or they could be kind of major road bumps, as in the sense of, for example, there is a massively infectious and deadly disease called COVID spreading across the globe, and it means that factories have to shut down, and people quite literally can't go to work and can't produce. Okay, so there are always inevitably road bumps. There's always something that's going to pop up to interfere with this kind of spiral process of creation within capitalism. But because capitalism demands that capital is always accumulating, the system must grow infinitely in order to survive, right? So it is kind of a central tenet of capitalism that we have infinite growth. The problem, however, is that in a world like ours, which has natural limits, infinite growth is quite literally impossible. Which means that there must inevitably be some major crisis in capitalism that spells its downturn. Whatever that crisis is looks different depending on who you're talking about. So it might be something like full automation to the full automation, meaning like robots are doing all of the labor. So workers are now unnecessary, and as a result, workers will revolt against the leadership because they don't have their needs met, right? If they're not working, they're not getting kind of wages, which means they can't go and get money. They can't go and get food. They can't afford to keep a roof over their head, something like that. The crisis might be that there's just no more resources, right? That we've just kind of entirely ran out. We've used all of them here. The crisis might be climate change. The crisis might be global conflicts. Whatever that crisis is, it is kind of a central tenet. So the capitalists would say that infinite growth is, obviously possible, but given that we exist within a world that has natural limitations, infinite growth in reality is not actually possible. And so there must eventually be some kind of collapse. So those really are the central tenets of how capitalism works, right? So it is an economic system of privatized ownership whereby labor power is combined with raw materials to create surplus value for the capitalist class. The capitalist will then sell that labor for more than it's worth, which means it is fundamentally an exploitative relationship. That growth model is a spiral one, which has to kind of come down eventually. Okay, so that is what capitalism is. If we're turning now towards neoliberalism, and about roughly the 1970s, the actual exact date is, a bunch of people argue about it, but generally speaking, roughly the 1970s, the rise of Ronald Reagan in the US and then Margaret Thatcher in the UK, capitalism starts to be expanded outside of the market and is used as a way of explaining everyday individual lives. Okay, so neoliberalism, which is not capitalism, neoliberalism is instead the market rationality of capitalism, which expands that idea of how capitalism works, right? This idea of infinite growth into everything that is not the market, okay? So the market rationality of capitalism expands into everything else. That is the idea of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is this idea that the logic of the market is what we should use to explain how everything works. Okay, so it is very, very similar to capitalism, right? Because it kind of uses that same rationality, but it is not actually the same thing as capitalism, because capitalism is about the market, whereas neoliberalism is about the logic behind markets being how everyone should live their lives. So I really like this Wendy Brown quote that I have listed here. I think it helps explain this idea, and then I'll try and provide some examples that should help out a little bit as well. So Wendy Brown says that neoliberalism reaches from the soul of the citizen subject to education policies, to practices of empire. It is not only or even primarily focused on the economy. It involves extending and disseminating market values to all institutions and all social actions. Okay, so neoliberalism is not the free market, nor is it capitalism, but it is a particular political rationality of the market that says, here's how you should think about everything else. Okay, so neoliberalism, for example, is why institutions prioritize economic gains, right? So it is a neoliberal idea for schools for example, to want to worry about making money, right? Or it's a neoliberal idea to say that, you know, you as an individual should go and get a well-paying job and should prioritize making money in your life. And like that is how you are kind of fulfilled. Does that distinction make sense between capitalism and neoliberalism? I think understanding the distinction matters a lot in terms of reading these arguments in debate or in terms of answering these arguments in debate. Because if we assume that neoliberalism and capitalism are the same thing, then we start to, when we conflate them, then our answers become just a little bit different from each other. And that slight difference oftentimes can make the difference between winning and losing a debate, especially at really high levels. So everyone's on board with that distinction?
I had a question.
Yeah,
you mentioned like the market was like capitalism is the market, whereas neoliberalism the logic behind the market. What's the difference between these two things?
The difference is that the capitalism keeps the market separate, right? Capitalism is about the market. Like quite literally in the old times when people like lived in villages, right? They woke up in the morning and were like, I am going to go to the market, and at the market, I'm going to buy and sell goods, right? But the idea of how the market works, right? This like buying and selling of goods, like that being how you should live your life, that assumption doesn't show up until neoliberalism.
Okay.
I also have a quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
So I've heard neoliberalism defined as a faith in free market capitalism. Would that be incorrect, or would it be kind of similar to how you describe it?
I think it's similar depending on how you're defining those words. So like a faith in free market capitalism, like the idea of faith to me could be kind of like saying it's a way to live your life. But technically speaking, neoliberalism could exist without capitalism, and capitalism could exist without neoliberalism. Like obviously that's not how the world actually works, but it is theoretically possible. And so I think it is good to separate those things theoretically in your mind.
That makes sense.
Any other questions so far? And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of these tenets involving neoliberalism. But I do want to talk about this idea of political rationality real quick. And this actually maybe will kind of help with your question a bit more as well, Catherine, because I use the term political rationality deliberately, because neoliberalism is political, right? It's about politics, it's about policies, and it is a rationality, meaning a logic or a defining what is rational. So it's kind of sort of like an epistemology. It can be used in service of an ideology, right? So neoliberalism can be used to kind of facilitate capitalism. But right, so like neoliberalism doesn't say this is how things are. Rather, neoliberalism is more about this is how things should be. Right, so neoliberalism isn't like, you know, everybody automatically thinks in terms of dollar signs, or everybody automatically thinks in terms of, you know, I can better myself by getting a high-paying job. But neoliberalism says that that is how people should think about themselves. Okay, neoliberalism says that is how people should think about themselves. So to kind of, I don't know if this simplifies or complicates things, but another way of thinking about this is to say that neoliberalism is more of an epistemology, not an ontology, right? Ontology is about how we are, epistemology is about how we think, right? It's about how we should think about the world. So if we've got this kind of, you know, neoliberalism, this advancing of economic rationality in all facets of life, it affects everything. Right, so it includes things like the government implementing austerity measures. It means that there is a looser social safety net, right? Because there's this idea of pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, right? You should be able to find the best paying job for yourself. And so you should not need to rely on the government. It incentivizes things like loosening trade restrictions. And it oftentimes means that citizenship itself is defined in terms of economic logics. So if any of you debated on the immigration topic, for example, you know that kind of the logic of all of these different kinds of visas, the reason there are so many different kinds of them, and the reason why some immigrants are allowed into this country and some immigrants are not, oftentimes it's because the government looks at these people and says, okay, you are a productive citizen, and by productive we mean you think that you are going to make a lot of money. Right, so neoliberalism says that that is a legitimate way to decide who should come into this country and who should not be able to come into this country. So there kind of becomes, so part of how you think about, or part of why I use this citizenship example here is hopefully it solidifies what neoliberalism means, but I also think that it helps point towards how neoliberalism, this kind of extension of market logic, really, really matters in how we're thinking about the state and how the state kind of gets constructed. Okay, so the state becoming a neoliberal tool is significant because now state policies will be determined around, you know, who is most productive, right? Who is living a life that best follows this neoliberal rationality. You'll also notice that the root of the word neoliberalism is the word liberalism, and that's really important for neoliberalism as well. So liberalism at its very root is just this idea that individuals should be given the most freedom possible, and that the regulation of those freedoms is what causes evils in the world. Right, so neoliberalism also kind of traffics in this understanding of liberalism in that it takes as a central tenet that the individual is the smallest unit, right? I use the word unit there in particular, or I use the word unit on purpose, right? Because that kind of is an example of neoliberal rationality, right? If we're understanding people as units, right, as kind of a tool for economic production, right? If people as individuals are the smallest and thus base level unit for production, then they are also the most important part of production, right? Because if we don't have individuals, then production doesn't make sense anymore. And so as a result, neoliberalism atomizes individuals, right? Atomizes is a term you probably heard if you've looked at any neolib file before. It really just means that people are understood as individuals rather than collectives, right? That term atomization. And so that matters because then as a result, if it's all about the individual, right, it's all about, you know, you as a separate person are the baseline unit for production, then you have the responsibility to better yourself and better the world from within this neoliberal paradigm, right? And that's kind of where this pull yourselves up by the bootstrap mentality comes from. I think that metaphor, pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, is a really, really important one for thinking about what is and is not neoliberal. Because that idea of that metaphor, by the way, of pull yourselves up by the bootstrap is just this idea that, you know, even in the face of all of these structural inequalities and all of the things that get thrown in your way, you as an individual should be good enough to overcome those things and better yourself. Right? So a neoliberal rationality would say that, you know, to like poor Black woman would say, even though there are structural inequalities that are, you know, in your way, right? Like racism, sexism, starting out poor, all of these things, neoliberalism would say that you should be able to make it to the top anyways. So when you're reading evidence about neoliberalism, that evidence is talking about this rationality, right? This logic of liberalist free marketism, which then applies to every tenet of how every individual life works, right? It suggests that we become the best subjects or the best versions of ourselves that we possibly can be by improving ourselves according to what the market deems best. Okay, and that is different than just capitalism. And that difference is particularly important when we start talking about Marxism, because what Marx is talking about is not just, Marx isn't really talking about neoliberalism, right? Because idea of neoliberalism isn't really developed until after Marx's death. But Marx is talking about like, oh gee, this economic relationship between the capitalist class, the what was the word I was looking for? The employer and the employee. Does all this make sense so far? Okay, let's talk about Marxism for a little bit here. Several things to know about Marxism. So Marx is a structuralist philosophy, which structuralism is this idea that humans can be accounted for within structures. So it's to say that there is some kind of social structure that is created by collections of humans, and that explains then how the social world works. So Marx says that the social structure of capitalism is the kind of fundamental relationship between that explains how people operate, right? Like Marx says that like our existence as workers is like the fundamental thing. To give you some other examples of structuralist philosophy, like Lacan is a structuralist because Lacan fundamentally says that the unconscious is structured like a language, and that is what explains how a whole bunch of other things work. I truthfully don't know how Wilderson self-describes or describes himself, but I think of Wilderson as a structuralist because he says that anti-blackness explains how the world works, right? Any of these philosophers, these theorists that say, here is a social structure, it can explain how the entire world works, that's structuralism. Okay, and for Marx, the structure that determines reality is capitalism. Marx says that in order to get past capitalism, which is, of course, the root of all evils, we need to have a kind of dialectical or historical materialism. So dialectical or historical materialism has three components to it, which I will break down for you. Do I have this on the next slide? First part is dialectics, which is this part in words. What's the word? Quotations. That's not the word. Whatever. You all know what I'm talking about. These little lines whose name I just totally forgot for some reason. First part, dialectics. Marx was heavily influenced by a guy named Hegel, who was a German philosopher whose basic thesis is this. So the world works by, there's a radical swing in one direction, there's a radical swing in another direction, and then those two sides kind of mash together, and then that is how humanity moves forwards. Okay, so dialectics is this radical swing in one way, radical swing in another way, mash together, move forward. Okay, and Hegel says that's how the entire history of humanity works. Marx says that these swings are between the capitalist ruling class and the exploited worker. Okay, so we've got a swing towards capitalism, and then because capitalism must inevitably collapse upon itself, right, inevitable crises, swings back towards the worker. Okay, and then eventually these things are kind of pushed together in some kind of giant social crisis, which forces society to move towards socialism. Okay, Marx says like you cannot have socialism without previously having capitalism. Okay, no socialism without having capitalism originally. Which is why, you know, all of these things about like rising out of the ashes of capitalism. It's kind of a common metaphor that people talk about from the Marxist position. Okay, so that's kind of how dialectics work, right? And that's why the first word in his dialectical materialism or historical materialism is the word dialectics, right? Because remember, so we could call it dialectical materialism that uses the word dialectics. We could call it historical materialism, which, remember, Marx following Hegel says history works in that kind of almost pendulum way. And so that's the first half of that. Second part is about materialism, which is about the labor power or means of production. It's about the kind of totality of material practices. Materialism, by the way, in the Marxist sense, is not just things that are matter. It's not just like literally, physically, concretely, but rather materialism is about material praxis. So the matter that is used for production, the matter that is used for production is what matters here. Matter that is not used for production is not materialism, according to Marx. And so it's really about this kind of return to labor power, this return to the means of production that's necessary for a Marxist revolution. Okay, so the kind of really conservative or like OG Marxism suggests that things are all about class. Most people have kind of expanded that to account for different power relations, and instead suggest that while it is still fundamentally about class, that there are other things that there are other inequalities that also are important for talking about. So I like this Stephen Tomino quote here to start to explain some of this. Stephen Tomino says, "To know contemporary society and to be able to act on such knowledge, one has to first of all know what makes the existing social totality," right? So there's that word totality again that we talked about at the beginning, right? The totality of human existence. Tomino says, "I will argue that the dominant social totality is based on inequality, not just inequality of power, but inequality of economic access, which then determines access to healthcare, education, housing, diet, transportation." Right? So it's not just about power, right? It's not just about race, sex, gender, sexuality, etc., but about inequality of economic access. This systematic inequality cannot be explained by gender, race, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, or nationality. These are all secondary contradictions and are all determined by the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is inscribed in the relation of capital and labor. Okay, so that quote there, still talks about things like gender, race, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, nationality, etc., right? Tomino's like, those things still matter, right? Those things still matter, but they matter insofar as they relate to and intersect with class and labor violences. In other words, the particular way that we can pinpoint and explain how a lot of violence along lines of gender, race, sexuality, disability, etc. occur is from within a lens of class, from within a lens of capitalism. Now, I don't think that is to suggest that all possible violences against gender, race, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, nationality, etc. I don't think it's to say that all of those things are determined solely by capitalism, but it is to say that if the fundamental social totality is one that is written by capitalism, then we have to address that from within our critiques in order to kind of create change. Okay, so that's where this materialism kind of component comes in here. Third piece to really know about is that it's all about history. Okay, the idea is really that we have to aim to map the world so that we can change it. Okay, the idea is that we have to find historical knowledges in order to understand where and how capitalism pervades throughout society, and only then can the revolution come about. Right, this also makes sense given the conversation about dialectics that we said before, right? If there are swings between the ruling and non-ruling class, we have to map those historical moments, understand where those swings happen in order to understand how capitalism has evolved to maintain itself, right? So if there was a swing because, there was a crisis about lacking materials in a particular place, how did capitalism overcome it? And then how can we develop new strategies that stop capitalism from overcoming those crises in the future? So history then is important. History is not just a kind of here's what happened kind of thing, but rather it is a heuristic. History is a heuristic or a roadmap or a method for finding out what should be done next. Right? Remember that there are always multiple histories to tell, which is why, for example, we can read about slavery as being a product of anti-Blackness, or we could read about slavery as being a product of capitalism, right? There are always multiple different histories to tell, but the particular retelling of history that was given is important for mapping the dialectics of capitalism and figuring out how to fight against it. So the history that we should be telling is one that is about anti-capitalism instead. It's kind of the Marxist position. So to summarize the section, Marxism is a structural philosophy. It says that capitalism is the root of all evils. We dialectically struggle against it by returning to materialism and reading particular moments throughout history, which then opens room for the revolution against the system of capitalism and for a better life. Does that make sense to people? Do we have questions?
Quick question. On the part on Marxism part 3, would can you explain the subpoint history is how you say that?
Heuristic.
Yeah, can you explain that?
Yeah, so that's just a way of saying that history is a roadmap or a method, right? So the method of Marxism is to use is history itself, right? So normally I think that we think of history as a kind of like, here's what happened. There were certain events and let's describe those events. But Marxism says that no, actually, you can describe events from a whole bunch of different perspectives. The correct way to describe events is from a capitalist perspective. And so we can use history then as a way of understanding how capitalism has reified itself and how crises in capitalism have come about so that those can be exploited for change. Does that make sense?
So basically looking at history as a way to see how capitalism has how do I say it? Like re-analyzed itself in order to like create change by understanding its processes in the past.
Yep.
I had a question in relation to the totality of capitalism. So at a point, it was like the status quo is, if we make a prescriptive argument that the status quo is totally capitalist, then we should focus the revolution on dismantling capitalism. But you also said at some point that capitalism can't explain all sorts of violence. So why should capitalism be centered if it can't explain away all instances of violence?
Because, I was kind of tipping my hand a little bit there. So there's kind of a couple different answers to this. So the like OG Marxists, like Marx himself would say, yes, it is all explained by capitalism. And I say here that I'm tipping my hand a little bit because when I talk, I'll talk more about this when we get into the Marxism as a K argument. I think in reality, that's just like impossible to defend. Like, I don't think that capitalism can explain, for example, like why disproportionately people of color are targeted for police violence. I think there are like some inroads to it probably, but I just like broadly speaking think that that probably doesn't explain all of it. And so the way that at least I read this Tomino quote that I had here, and the way that you all should consider talking about the totality argument in debate, is to suggest that if capitalism explains how kind of the majority of material violences, capitalism explains how all material violences operate, in material in the sense of Marxist definition of material. It means that a telling of history that revolves around anti-capitalism is a better telling of history than whatever telling of history that we have, or than whatever other telling of history there is. It functionally just becomes a K outweighs the case argument. But it is to say that like newer Marxist theorists and newer anti-capitalists do recognize that there are other contradictions, other power relations that also explain how some violences occur. And so,
I sort of had another question about the way that links operate. So we specifically said that if capitalism doesn't account for everything, it makes the perm possible, but then a lot of like links to cap that come to chaos are usually like, you use race, that's bad. Do you know like a sort of link that's better than that just generic like race bad
hold
link?
that thought for a sec, because we're gonna get there.
Okay, and then one last thing, neoliberalism, does it operate on an individual level, or does it operate through the distinctions of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie?
So neoliberalism operates on an individual level. It is not about the relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It can infiltrate that relationship because, it can infiltrate that relationship from the bottom up in terms of it infiltrates the individual, and then the individual works within that proletariat bourgeoisie relationship. But neoliberalism also operates from the top down, and that it determines certain populations and identifies certain populations based on their economic productivity, right? So there's a population of immigrants, for example, that neoliberalism would determine these people should be allowed to come into this country because we think that they will be productive, but these people should not be allowed to come into the country because we do not think that they will be productive.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah.
I had a question about, you mentioned like capitalism explains the majority of issues. Like, what's an example, a few examples of how it explains like race issues?
So hold this thought. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the case stuff.
Quick question, because I kind of came in like a couple minutes late because I had like a problem with like the password and whatever.
Yeah.
Like, going on the, can you like first like go back to the capitalism slides, and then like I was gonna ask you like, can you just like re-explain like what's your your definition of capitalism in itself, like just like a brief understanding of what it is.
So I don't want to go back and totally re-explain capitalism. Like this is being recorded. You can definitely go back and watch it. But I will say that the way you should think about capitalism is that it's about the economic system, right? It's about, there's an economic system where businesses and corporations own means of production. And as a result, there is a exploitative relationship between a employer and the employee.
Okay.
Other questions so far? So the way you should think about deploying Marxism as a critique in debate is that it's all about history. Okay, it's all about history, right? The point is that the affirmative did not write history correctly. Because they have not written history correctly, then class violences become inevitable, right? They become recreated into the world. And so we instead need to have a proper understanding of history. Okay, right? So Marxism's all about history already, right? The idea is that whatever the 1AC reading of history is wrong. So when the 1AC reads like an anti-blackness affirmative and it talks about anti-blackness being the explanation for slavery and how that is then replicated into modern society, you need to be like, the largest proximate explanation for how slavery works is one induced by class and labor production, okay? So like the justification for going to Africa to take slaves instead of grabbing a bunch of white slaves, I put that in quotations because what determined whiteness at that point in time was different than how we determine whiteness right now, was this idea of needing to separate individuals or separate peoples from each other in such a way that they cannot revolt against the bourgeoisie in America. So it made more sense to go and take Africans from different places throughout Africa and then separate them from their individual families, right? So like let's say like 3 people from a particular tribe or a particular nation were taken, they would then be separated out and put into different places so that, different slaves didn't know each other. So they, already didn't have a relationship with each other. They also didn't speak the same languages as each other oftentimes. They certainly didn't speak the same languages as the oppressors or the natives. And so the logic then becomes that, it stops them from revolting, right? The tactic of capitalism was to be racialized in that manner. And it's to say, the affirmative wrote history wrong, right? They said that history is, or they said that the history of slavery is one that is revolving around anti-blackness, right? But actually, it's revolving around class violences. The fact that they have written the history of slavery incorrectly means that class violences get replicated because we don't understand the particular contradictions of capitalism, right? We don't learn the strategies that capitalism used to separate individuals and force them apart from each other. And instead, we should reject that understanding of history for our understanding of history, which writes slavery correctly. Okay, and so the Marxism critique, as it gets deployed in debate, is about looking at the 1AC and saying, no, you are wrong about how the world works. So it's not really to stand up and say, you talked about race, therefore you didn't talk about class. Like that's not a link argument, right? But it is to stand up and say, the way that you have talked about race is one that misunderstands how the history of race works. And to kind of get to this distinction I said before about largest proximate cause versus, explaining how everything works, that I think it was Arian was asking about this question earlier, is that I think it's valuable to basically take this argument about totality, which sounds like a root cause argument, and instead word it in terms of the largest proximate cause for the purpose of debate, because it then allows you to, since you have to, in the Marxism debate, get into the nitty-gritty of history, right? Why do these things happen? It means that you have to understand the intricacies of the 1AC. Right, if you call it the largest proximate cause, it means that you don't have to understand everything about the 1AC. Right, you may not have an example, may not have an explanation of how, systems of class and labor production caused the particular person that they are talking about in the 1AC to be murdered by the cops. But you do have an explanation, for example, of why police itself have been radically expanded because, the law, the need to protect the law is about protecting private property, right? It's about protecting the about protecting the bourgeoisie class who is oppressing the proletariats. Right, and so I think that's the benefit of calling it largest proximate cause instead of calling it root cause in a debate. And hopefully, I think answers that question that we had before. Okay, I like this argument. I like wording it in terms of class and labor production instead of capitalism in a debate. So first of all, you are not reading a capitalism critique. You are reading a Marxism critique, which I think you want to call it a Marxism critique instead, because number one, if you call it a CapK, your judge is going to look at you and think that you're making this generic, oh, they talked about race, therefore they didn't talk about class, so you have to reject them argument, right? So you want to use different language in order to try and convince your judge that, or not really, I guess, tell your judge that's not the argument that you're making. And then number two, I think using the different language also helps you stop making the bad versions of the link argument. And so I always recommend using the term class and labor production or class and labor violences instead of just capitalism broadly, because it helps to point us away from those things. Are these ideas making some sense? I will talk about the permutation a bit more on the next slide, but if there are more questions here, I can answer those now.
Can you, so like the example you gave us, the AF is using slavery. I mean, that says that the root cause of slavery is anti-Blackness, but they are reading history wrong because cap was based off of racializing people. And then where does the story go from there? Like, you should reject their notion of how they view history, and that it got blurry after that.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'll say that it's not about capitalism based off of racializing, but rather that racializing becomes possible in terms of capitalism within the example of slavery. But to kind of answer your actual question, Mac, if it's all about history. So if it's all about history, right? So, from an anti-capitalist reading of slavery would say, here are the ways that the capitalist class used ways that the capitalist class kept down or stopped revolutions within slavery, right? They divided people apart from each other. They made sure that no people from the same family or same tribe or same nation were put onto the same plantation. They ensured that part of why they did that is just so people didn't know each other. Also because then people weren't speaking the same languages as each other, which meant it was harder for them to communicate, which meant, they couldn't talk about how terrible things were with each other or talk about how to revolt against the ruling class. Right, so these were strategies used by the capitalist class to stop the revolution from happening, right? And if we don't read history from the lens of anti-capitalism, then we're not understanding those strategies, which means that, capitalism, which we all agree is like pretty bad, is going to keep using those strategies in the future to replicate itself and create more violences, right? So the affirmative's reading of history actually directly causes capitalist violences. It is not that the affirmative's reading of history is necessarily capitalist, but it is that the affirmative's reading of history becomes a tool for the capitalist class to create more class and labor violences. Are you with me so far?
Yeah, so like basically, like if we do not read capitalism through if we do not read history through the lens of capitalism, then like it would just cause more class labor violence due to the fact, and which would like basically like just turn all impacts on the AF, I'm guessing, because like they're not reading history right.
Yeah. So,
then, like,
so
what would an alt? What would an alt what would an alt look like?
So,
just reading history right.
Yeah, so in terms of the impact thing that you were saying, there's definitely a huge turns case kind of component, right? Like if we don't read history correctly, then the violences of the 1AC will inevitably continue happening. But there's also just an impact associated that's just like class and labor violences themselves are bad. And so think about it in both those ways, is like we have a separate external impact that's like there's a worker exploitation relationship that is bad, and also turns case. The alternative does look like let's read history correctly. Right, so the alternative says, here's how we should be reading an anti-capitalist history. And so part of it becomes that in the debate, you actually do literally walk us through, okay, this is how they think slavery works. Here is how an anti-capitalist reading of slavery works. And here is why it is a preferable reading of slavery.
I have a question about how that sort of class violence occurs. So reading history is wrong, but what is the internal link of reading history wrong and that violence that occurs?
If we read, so remember the dialectics, the kind of like pendulum thing, right? So the pendulum swings inevitably. There are crises in capitalism no matter what happens. If our job as historical materialists is to figure out where those crises have happened and what caused those crises so that we can use those strategies both to A, stop capitalism from doing what it did to fix those crises in the first place, and B, exploit those strategies to take down capitalism.
Okay. And then, so that's where the strategic element of like capitalism will inevitably fail at some point and reproduces violence occurs?
Yeah, right. So crises are inevitable. It's about figuring out where and how those crises happen.
Got it. And then, one last question is like, other than like your historical reading of capitalism is wrong, is there any other link arguments that are made?
I think from a Marxist position, no, because it is all about history.
Okay.
And, in terms of the permutation, if that's a concern that you have, the argument needs to be really that there can only be one history, right? So the way you want to think about, like a metaphor that anti-capitalist scholars use all the time is this idea of capitalism being the many-headed hydra. Like the hydra is this, I don't remember if it's from Greek or Roman mythology, you'd think I know this by now, but it is like this three-headed like dragon monster thing where like when people fight it and they chop off one head, then another head comes in and starts to fight them. But at the same time, that head they chopped off regenerates and comes back. And so the idea is that you have to look at the totality of how capitalism works rather than a particular pieces of it necessarily. And so when we write history incorrectly, we are leaving room for capitalism to reify itself.
Got it. So in terms, now I have a different question. So what if they like phrase the permutation like, I mean, and inevitably you can't explain certain instances of violence for like an anti-blackness AF, like instances of violence that occur. Their permutation argument could be phrased around like, yes, they're like rereading and understanding of history might be good in certain contexts, but also our theorization explains some things. So the two conjoined can make an overall theorization that's better for understanding how violence occurs.
Well, if you've got arguments for why parts of the AF's history is wrong, then that's severance, right? Okay. Then that permutation severs out of the 1AC's history, right? It selectively picks. It's the same thing as like if you're reading a security K against a policy affirmative. If the 2AC stands up and is just like, okay, you're right, you know, terrorist threats, totally constructed. We're not going to talk about those things anymore. We'll agree with what you have said.
Got it.
Right, and so that permutation is illegitimate, I think is what I'd say. And then yes, there is kind of a solvency deficit to the alternative when they get to say, you know, your history doesn't explain this thing. Ideally, you want to be able to say that your history does explain everything the 1AC talks about. But in that instance, you know, let's say you don't actually explain everything the 1AC talks about. In that instance, then it's just, you know, your critique outweighs the act is what you do. So once we've got this position of history is all that matters, I think everything else kind of falls into place, right? The affirmative is going to stand up and be like, we are anti-capitalist. But if you're like, okay, but you don't understand history correctly, then you get to be like, you're not historical materialist, right? We're not a CapK, we're a historical materialism critique. And B, that means that your anti-capitalist efforts will be ineffective, right? If you don't understand history correctly, it doesn't matter. I actually think the potential biggest concern is I like to call it the Ross 2K argument, which I call it that because a lot of anti-blackness teams read this card in particular. And they read it because it is very rhetorically powerful. There's a line in there that says something along the lines of, these anti-capitalist movements tell Black people to sit down and shut up. And so that becomes the basic idea, is that, you know, you push anti-racist movements to the back burner, which is bad. I think you want to be like, no, the history of anti-blackness movements are actually on our side, right? The Black Panther Party, you know, kind of had a real fundamental relationship towards anti-capitalism in such a way that made like the Black Panther Party was so much more material in the Marxist sense than whatever the affirmatives random theorizing will talk about. Right, and like Wilderson has like super hardcore beef with Marx, right? Because Wilderson is like a structuralist critique, right? Wilderson's like, it's all about anti-blackness, and Marx is like, no, it's all about systems of class and labor production. And so it becomes about, can you explain history in such a way that that I think you want to do both these things. That both means link this argument, right? The real history of anti-racist movements is one that is in favor of your alternative, not in favor of the affirmative. And two, that means the K outweighs the case for various reasons, right? But if you started from this position that like history is what matters, then I think really everything else kind of falls into place.